many of you all have been aware of this early on, to be honest, during this Russia-Ukraine conflict, this proxy war that the United States of America is definitely funding by and through Ukraine and through its undue influence in NATO, that the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, the lower Congress, passed a bill to punish African nations. Now, this act, and the Senate, after that particular time, 2021, a year later, just last year in 2022, thankfully an African organization, which I'm going to talk about very briefly, pushed back on it. But I want to talk about this briefly because I'm staying on top of the implications and the progress of this bill passing, because obviously after in the United States, after the House of Representatives passes a bill, then it goes on to the Senate, and from the Senate is signed into law if it's properly passed by both houses. It's signed into law by the president. So I'm staying on top of the progress of this, but I wanted to know if you all were aware that this has been taking place in the United States, the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. That's what it's called. Being prepared in the U.S. Senate, which will, quote, direct the Secretary of State to develop and submit to Congress a strategy and implementation plan outlining the United States effort to counter the malign influence and activities of the Russian Federation and its proxies in Africa. Now, what I find interesting about this act that they include in this is that it says that the act will direct the United States government to, quote, regularly assess the scale and scope of the Russian Federation's influence and activities in Africa that undermine the United States objectives and interests, and determine how to address and counter such influence and activities effectively, including through appropriate United States foreign assistance programs, and hold accountable the Russian Federation and African governments and their officials who are complicit in aiding in such malign influence and activities. It also, watch this part, this is very important, it also directs the Secretary of State to, quote, develop and submit to the appropriate congressional committees a strategy and implementation plan outlining United States efforts to counter the malign influence and activities of the Russian Federation and its proxies in Africa. And that they're supposed to do that no later than 90 days after the date of that. Now, sometime a few months ago, at the time that you're viewing this year, because of this act that had already passed through the House of Representatives and moving its way through the Senate to progress, the SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community, shout out to them, they opposed the United States bill that countering malign Russian activities in Africa. It says that there are a 16-member group, the SADC is a 16-member group, chastise efforts by U.S. lawmakers to, quote-unquote, punish African countries who try to help Russia bypass sanctions and restrictions imposed over its invasion of Ukraine. It goes on to talk a little bit more detail about this rejection and imposition of punishment by the United States against the African continent. It says the summit adopted the draft African Union Declaration on the USA proposed Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act and urged member states to communicate SADC's position and reaffirm the stance of non-alignment on conflicts outside the continent and the region at the multilateral forum. Now, family, it's very disturbing because this has been kept quiet in mainstream news that this took place pretty early on in the conflict. So they knew Africa was not, many of the states in Africa were unwilling to jump in and get in the middle of this Russia-Ukraine conflict. So because of that, the United States does what she unfortunately does too often, and that is try to bully countries and pass an actual actor in the United States to, in essence, punish them if they didn't take a particular stance and if they chose to work with Russia. And this, to me, seems to indicate that they are allowed to basically spy and to watch what's going on there. I reported some months back here on the network that one of our ambassadors had to apologize for inappropriately accusing them of working with Russia, supplying them with weapons. That's what it was. Found out that there was no substantial evidence or substantive evidence that would justify the a black U.S. ambassador making that allegation. But once again, that has not made mainstream news, which is why, thank God for such platforms and networks like the African Diaspora News Channel and the Vicky Show here. Talk black to me, somebody. We're going to, of course, stay on top of this, the progress of this, and the fallout of this. But I wasn't sure if the family was aware that this had even been taking place over the past couple of years or so, and the fact that we would even dare do such a thing. How can we show respect to other countries when we bully them, when we don't take on, when folks that we consider to be an enemy, if the other countries don't see them to be an enemy and treat them accordingly, we do turn around and impose punitive actions against them? In my opinion, that's an absolute no. My name is Vicky Dillon. Of course, we're going to stay on top of this.
Remember I told y'all earlier in the video, the U.S. always got their 2 cents in other country business. And y'all heard this video. So they're going to put sanctions on all African countries because they're not working with the U.S. So what's the concern? If Africa is giving Russia weapons, look how much y'all gave Ukraine in aid instead of funding the war that y'all had no business putting y'all 2 cents in. See, ladies and gentlemen, I'd rather produce the facts and show you proof that this country is a bigot